Judge Robert Cartwright was a man of order and discipline. His courtroom ran like a finely tuned machine. He prided himself on keeping things moving with no room for excuses. He had been a judge for nearly 30 years and had seen it all: the familiar faces, the endless paperwork, the cases that seemed to blur together. But today was different. As he glanced over the docket, he saw a name that caught his attention: Darmiah Williams. He didn't know why it stood out to him. Perhaps it was the title. After all, most people who came through his courtroom didn't have the honor of a doctorate, but he thought little of it and moved on to the next case. The courtroom buzzed with the usual noise, a murmur of voices as people waited for their turn. Maya entered quietly and with confidence, her presence commanding attention, though she didn't seem to notice or care about the eyes that followed her. She was dressed in a simple but elegant suit, her posture impeccable, and her gaze steady. She was the kind of person who didn't need to speak loudly to be noticed. Her demeanor spoke volumes. Judge Cartwright glanced up at her from his desk, his eyes narrowing briefly as he assessed her, not with curiosity, but with an instinctual judgment. Based on years of experience, he assumed she was another woman trying to talk her way out of something trivial. Darmiah Williams was here for a simple parking violation. She had parked in an area that was marked restricted, and though she had a valid argument, she wasn't here to fight the system. She wasn't here to waste time. She stood tall and began to explain the situation calmly. The parking spot had been poorly marked, she claimed, and it wasn't clear that it was a tow zone, at least not in a way that was obvious to the average person. Judge Cartwright listened half-heartedly. He had heard every excuse before and dismissed them just as easily. Today wouldn't be any different. He glanced down at the paperwork in front of him, scanning through it without really reading it. He thought to himself that people often made these kinds of claims to avoid taking responsibility for their own actions. She continued speaking, her voice clear and firm, but not aggressive. She didn't raise her tone, nor did she falter when Cartwright finally looked up from the papers. His eyes met hers for the first time, her gaze unwavering. She wasn't asking for sympathy or even an apology. She was simply presenting her side of the story, yet Cartwright couldn't shake the feeling that there was something different about her, something about the way she carried herself and the way she spoke. Even the quiet confidence in her voice made him feel a little uneasy, but he dismissed it quickly. He had a job to do, and that job didn't involve getting distracted by unnecessary details. After a few moments of silence, Cartwright cleared his throat and gave his ruling with a sense of finality. The fine would stand, he said, without much emotion, dismissing her without any acknowledgement of her argument. Dodd Williams stood for a moment without a word, her face composed and unreadable. She didn't protest or argue. Instead, she simply nodded respectfully, gathered her things, and left the courtroom. As she walked out the door, Judge Cartwright sat back in his chair, a sense of satisfaction settling in his chest. The case was over, and he had done his duty, but little did he know that today would mark the beginning of something that would change everything he thought he knew about justice and fairness. Later that evening, the world would learn something that would make Judge Cartwright rethink everything. As the city buzzed with the usual post-work energy, a news bulletin interrupted regular programming, capturing the attention of everyone in the room. The newscaster, a calm and steady voice, announced that President Fitzgerald had just nominated a new Supreme Court justice. The name was familiar, though Cartwright couldn't immediately place it. Then the anchor spoke the name again, and this time it struck him like a lightning bolt. Asterisk, asterisk, Dr. Maya Williams, asterisk, asterisk. Cartwright paused mid-sip of his coffee, the cup lowering slowly from his lips as his mind raced. Asterisk, asterisk, Dr. Maya Williams, asterisk, asterisk, was that the same woman from his courtroom? He quickly grabbed the remote and turned up the volume. The anchor continued detailing her impressive resume, her accomplishments in civil rights, her groundbreaking work in law, and her rising prominence as a leader in the fight for justice and equality. He listened in disbelief, his heart starting to race. He couldn't be sure at first, but when they flashed her picture on the screen, the pieces clicked into place. It was her, the same calm, dignified woman who had been standing in front of him just hours earlier, asking for fairness for something as simple as a parking ticket. For a moment, Cartwright sat frozen, staring at the screen. Maya Williams wasn't just any woman. She was now one of the most important figures in the country, a person poised to join the highest court in the land. The realization hit him hard. This wasn't just any case. This wasn't just another ordinary citizen. This was a legal titan, a trailblazer in her field. And here he had been, dismissing her with a simple fine, not recognizing the weight of her presence. The news continued, detailing how she had spent decades working for social justice, fighting for systemic change in the legal system, and pushing for reforms that would impact generations to come. Cartwright could hardly believe what he was hearing. He had seen so many people in his courtroom before, so many lives coming and going, that he had never taken a moment to consider who they really were beyond their cases. But this woman was different, and he had missed it. He reached for his phone, his hands slightly shaking as he scrolled back through his notes from earlier. He needed to double-check the records, and sure enough, there it was. Dr. Maya Williams, a Harvard-educated lawyer, a professor, an advocate for the marginalized, and now a nominee for the highest legal office in the land. Cartwright felt a pit grow in his stomach as he thought back to their brief interaction in the courtroom. He had been so quick to judge her based on nothing more than his own assumptions and biases. The way he had dismissed her concerns, the way he hadn't taken a moment to truly hear her. It all rushed back to him in a flood of guilt. Asterisk, asterisk, why didn't I see it? Asterisk, asterisk, he wondered. The signs had been there all along, in the way she carried herself, in the confidence with which she spoke, in the quiet intelligence that radiated from her every word. But he had failed to recognize it. He had failed to see the person in front of him. Instead, he had focused on the minor offense and issued his ruling without any thought to who she truly was. The story about her nomination was everywhere, from news outlets to social media. Everyone was talking about Maya Williams, about the significance of her nomination, about how she represented a new chapter in American history. And Cartwright was left to wonder how he could have missed it all. Judge Cartwright couldn't stop thinking about it. The hours after he saw the news were a blur. The weight of his realization settled like a heavy stone in his chest, pushing down every other thought. He had always prided himself on being objective, on making decisions based on the facts. But now, looking back at the case he had just dismissed so easily, he could see how far he had missed the mark. Asterisk, asterisk, Dr. Maya Williams, asterisk, asterisk, wasn't just anyone. She was a person of immense accomplishment, a woman who had dedicated her life to making the world a better place. And he had treated her like just another defendant in his courtroom. That evening, after the media frenzy surrounding her nomination died down, Cartwright sat alone in his study, staring at the papers on his desk. The usual flow of work seemed meaningless now. The traffic cases, the petty misdemeanors, all of it felt trivial compared to what had just unfolded. He had met Maya Williams today in his very own courtroom and had failed to recognize the importance of the moment. The guilt gnawed at him, and with every passing hour, it deepened. How could he have been so blind? He thought back to her calm demeanor, the way she had held herself with such grace in the face of his judgment. He remembered the way she explained the details of the parking violation so clearly, with no anger, no bitterness. Yet, despite her composed nature, he had still given her a fine as if she were just another face in a long line of minor infractions. He couldn't help but wonder what would have happened if he had recognized who she was from the start. Would he have treated her differently? Would he have given her the respect she deserved? The more he thought about it, the more ashamed he became. This wasn't about a parking ticket anymore. It was about his own blind spots, his own biases, and the failure to see beyond the surface of a person. Cartwright had worked his entire career to become a judge who was known for his fairness and unwavering commitment to the law. He had built his reputation on being tough but fair, a no-nonsense judge who didn't tolerate excuses. But now he realized it wasn't enough to simply be fair on paper. The true measure of fairness lay in seeing people for who they really were, not just for the circumstances that brought them into the courtroom. As the days passed, Cartwright found himself unable to shake the feeling that something inside him had shifted. He had always been confident in his ability to make decisions quickly, to issue judgments without hesitation. But now, every decision felt like it needed to be carefully weighed, every case scrutinized with more than just a cursory glance. His confidence had been shattered, and it left him questioning whether he had truly been serving justice all these years. The more Cartwright thought about Maya Williams, the more he realized how much he had taken his position for granted. As a judge, he held power over others, but that power was never meant to be wielded without a deep sense of responsibility. He had a duty not just to enforce the law, but to understand it, to understand the people who came before him and the impact his decisions would have on their lives. His thoughts began to shift away from his own discomfort and toward Maya's. What kind of toll must it have taken on her to fight for the changes she believed in, only to be met with such indifference in the very place where fairness was supposed to reign? How often had people underestimated her, overlooked her, or dismissed her contributions simply because of her race, her gender, or her calm demeanor? It made him wonder how many other people had walked through his courtroom, people just like Maya, who had been treated with the same blindness. Cartwright knew there was only one way forward. He couldn't undo the past, but he could learn from it. He could start listening, really listening, to those who stood before him. He could start seeing people not as cases, but as individuals. Maya Williams had taught him that, even if she hadn't intended to, the path ahead would not be easy, and he knew it would take time to change, to unlearn the habits and assumptions that had been ingrained in him over the years. But one thing was clear: Maya Williams had opened his eyes to something far greater than the law. She had shown him the importance of seeing people for who they truly were. And that was the most important lesson he had learned in his entire career. The story of Judge Cartwright's handling of Maya Williams' case spread like wildfire. What had been a quiet, routine hearing in a small courtroom now became the subject of national debate. The news outlets were relentless, drawing connections between the incident and the broader issues of race, power, and justice. Cartwright's name, once associated with a reputation for fairness, was now linked with criticism and questions about his biases. It wasn't just the media that took notice. His colleagues, friends, and even his family started asking him tough questions. Social media was abuzz with opinions. Commentators, legal experts, and citizens alike dissected the details of that fateful day. Many were quick to point out the striking contrast between Maya Williams' calm, composed presence and Cartwright's blunt dismissal. Some questioned his competence, wondering how a judge could fail to recognize the gravity of the moment. Cartwright's decision to impose the fine on someone who was now a Supreme Court nominee felt, to many, like a glaring oversight, and the public demanded answers. At first, Cartwright tried to dismiss the noise. He told himself that the criticism was overblown, that it would die down in time. After all, he was just doing his job, wasn't he? It was a simple case, and his ruling had been based on the facts. But the more he tried to convince himself, the more the weight of the situation grew. The accusations of bias and the conversations around racial injustice started to chip away at his confidence. It wasn't just about the fine anymore. It was about what his actions, however small, represented in the larger picture of the justice system. The backlash wasn't limited to the media. Even within the legal community, Cartwright was facing scrutiny. His colleagues, some of whom had known him for years, began to question his judgment. Had he truly given Maya Williams a fair shake in his courtroom? Was his reputation for fairness just an illusion, a cover for a deeper, unexamined bias? The whispers and raised eyebrows made Cartwright uncomfortable, but it was the conversations he had with close friends that hit him the hardest. One evening, his longtime friend and fellow judge, Helen Russo, invited him out for dinner. As they sat down at a quiet restaurant, Helen didn't waste time. "Bob, what the hell happened in that courtroom?" she asked, her tone both serious and concerned. "I know you. You're better than this. So why did you treat her like that?" Helen's words stung. Cartwright had always prided himself on his integrity, but here was someone he respected deeply questioning whether he had lived up to his own standards. He explained his side of the story, how he had seen the case as just another routine matter, how he hadn't recognized Maya Williams for who she was. Helen didn't respond immediately, but took a long sip of her wine before speaking again. "Bob," she said, her voice softer now, "you know how people like Maya Williams get treated every day. And you're a judge, one of the people who's supposed to be better than that. Your decision wasn't just about the fine. It was about how you saw her. How you didn't see her. The words hit Cartwright like a punch to the gut. He had been so certain of his own righteousness, so confident that his approach to the law was infallible. Yet here was his closest friend, telling him that his blind spots had allowed him to overlook something far more significant than a parking violation. It was a painful realization, but it was one Cartwright needed to hear. As the days went on, Cartwright found himself growing more introspective. The media coverage didn't help, but it wasn't the criticism itself that bothered him. It was the reflection it forced him to undertake. He had spent so many years believing that he was a fair judge, that his decisions were based solely on the law, but now he wasn't so sure. He could no longer deny that something more was at play, something deeper than the facts of the case. He had acted on assumptions, on biases he hadn't even realized he had. And now, Maya Williams was at the center of a storm that had nothing to do with her work or her nomination, but everything to do with his inability to truly see her for who she was. Cartwright wasn't sure where this path would take him, but one thing was clear. The moment had changed him. Whether he wanted it or not, he was now a part of a much larger conversation about justice, fairness, and the real meaning of equality. Judge Cartwright sat alone in his office that evening, his desk littered with paperwork that felt insignificant compared to the weight on his shoulders. The public backlash had only intensified, and he couldn't escape the mounting guilt that lingered over his every thought. Each news segment, each post on social media seemed to hammer home the same message. He had failed Maya Williams. His reputation, once built on years of careful and measured judgments, was now tainted by a decision that, in hindsight, seemed so glaringly wrong. The more Cartwright reflected, the more he realized that the issue wasn't just the fine he had imposed. It was how he had failed to see Maya Williams as more than a case number. He had let his own biases, his own assumptions about what she was, cloud his judgment. She wasn't just another person in his courtroom. She was someone who had already made a tremendous impact in the world, someone whose voice mattered. Yet Cartwright had dismissed her as an afterthought. In the silence of his office, a small flicker of resolve began to form. He couldn't undo the past, but maybe, just maybe, he could make things right. The idea of reaching out to Maya weighed heavily on his mind. It wasn't just about the public outcry anymore. It was about personal redemption. It was about understanding what had gone wrong and facing the consequences of his actions. But how could he apologize to someone like her, someone who had already proven herself time and time again, only to be dismissed so easily by someone like him? He picked up the phone, his fingers hesitating over the buttons. A meeting seemed almost impossible. What would he even say? How could he begin to atone for his mistake? But then again, he knew that silence would only let the shame fester. And that wasn't an option. He dialed the number on the contact list he had found online, praying that Maya would answer. To his surprise, she did. Judge Cartwright. Maya's voice was calm, but not without a trace of guarded curiosity. Yes, Dr. Williams, Cartwright started, clearing his throat. He knew he had to tread carefully. I hope you're not too busy, but I'd like to speak with you. In person. There was a pause on the other end of the line, and for a moment, Cartwright feared that she would hang up. But then, in a tone that surprised him, Maya responded, I'm listening. His heart raced as he composed his thoughts. I've been thinking a lot about the day in your case, and I need to tell you I was wrong. I misjudged you, and I dismissed your argument in a way that I shouldn't have. I want to meet with you, not just to apologize, but to listen, to hear your perspective, if you'll allow me the chance. There was silence again, but this time, it didn't feel like rejection. Maya's voice, when it came, was steady. I appreciate you reaching out. Let's meet. The conversation ended shortly after that, and Cartwright sat back in his chair, a deep sense of relief washing over him. He had made the first step, but he also knew the real work was only just beginning. Apologies could only go so far. What mattered now was showing Maya, and everyone else, that he was capable of change, that he wasn't too proud to admit his faults and learn from them. The next few days were filled with a mix of nervous anticipation and deep introspection. Cartwright read through articles about Maya's career, her legal work, her efforts for social justice. It was clear that she was no ordinary person. She was a leader, a trailblazer. The more Cartwright read, the more he realized how little he truly knew about her. He had dismissed her as just another defendant, but in reality, she had spent her life building bridges, fighting for fairness, and striving to create a world where everyone, regardless of their background, was treated with respect. When the day of the meeting finally arrived, Cartwright found himself pacing his office. He had no idea what Maya would say or how she would respond to his apology. But he knew that this conversation was a turning point for both of them. It was his chance to make things right, to finally see her for who she truly was. And in doing so, perhaps he could begin to see himself differently, too. Judge Cartwright arrived early to the cafe, his nerves fluttering in his chest as he stood by the window, waiting for Maya Williams. The small cafe was cozy, tucked in the corner of a bustling city street. The warm scent of freshly brewed coffee and pastries filled the air, but it did little to ease his anxiety. He knew that this meeting would be more than just a conversation. It was a pivotal moment in his life, a chance for redemption and understanding. He had spent the past few days obsessing over what to say, rehearsing his apology in front of a mirror, trying to choose the right words that might convey the gravity of his actions. But now that the moment was finally here, all the preparation seemed inadequate. Nothing could erase the past. Nothing could undo the judgment he had passed on Maya. The only thing he could offer now was sincerity. The bell above the door jingled, and Cartwright turned. Maya walked in, her presence as commanding as it had been in his courtroom. She was dressed simply, yet with the same quiet elegance he had noticed earlier. She made her way to him, her steps purposeful, her face calm but unreadable. When she reached the table, she extended her hand. "Judge Cartwright," she said, her voice even, but there was a slight edge to it, perhaps a reflection of the weight of their shared history. "Maya," Cartwright replied, shaking her hand. "Thank you for meeting with me. I know this isn't easy." Maya took her seat across from him. She didn't say anything at first, just looked at him with an expression that was difficult to read. There was a moment of silence between them, as if both were waiting for the other to speak. Finally, Cartwright cleared his throat. "I've been thinking about that day a lot," he began, his voice steady but laced with regret. "I've been thinking about how I handled your case and how I failed to truly see you. I gave you a fine for something that was, in hindsight, so much more than just a parking violation. I misjudged you, and I misjudged the situation." Maya looked at him, her eyes calm, but there was a flicker of something behind them. Perhaps curiosity, perhaps skepticism. "I didn't recognize who you were," Cartwright continued. "I didn't realize the impact you've had, and I failed to treat you with the respect you deserve. I'm not here to make excuses. I'm here to tell you I was wrong." Maya took a deep breath, leaning back in her chair slightly. She said nothing for a long moment, and Cartwright couldn't tell if she was absorbing his words or waiting for him to say more. But finally, she spoke, her voice cool but measured. "You know, Judge," she said, "I've spent my life advocating for people who often get overlooked, people whose voices are silenced by the very systems that are supposed to protect them. I've stood up for the underrepresented, the marginalized. And I've learned that it's not always about the big fights. Sometimes it's about how we treat people in the small moments, in the everyday interactions, like when a judge dismisses you without even seeing who you are." Cartwright's heart sank. Maya's words hit harder than he had anticipated. She wasn't just talking about his decision. She was speaking to something deeper, something systemic. She was calling out the way his actions were part of a much larger pattern, one that affected so many people every day, people like her, people who weren't always given the dignity they deserved because others failed to look beyond the surface. "I understand," Cartwright said, his voice quieter now. "And I'm sorry. I see that now, and I wish I had seen it sooner." Maya nodded slightly, her expression softening, though she still seemed distant. "I'm not going to pretend that a simple apology fixes everything. It doesn't, but it's a start, Judge, and I appreciate that you're here. You're acknowledging your mistake, and that's rare." Cartwright felt a weight lift off his shoulders, but there was still more work to be done. This conversation wasn't just about clearing his conscience, it was about change, about growing and understanding. He wasn't naive enough to think one meeting would resolve everything, but perhaps, just perhaps, it could be the beginning of a new chapter for both of them. He exhaled slowly and leaned forward. I've spent my career making judgments, but I'm realizing that the most important thing I can do now is to listen to people like you, to see people for who they truly are, not just their circumstances. Maya was quiet for a moment, and then she nodded slowly, as if considering his words. I think you're on the right path, she said, her voice thoughtful. But it's not just about one apology or one good conversation. It's about a commitment to change. It's about recognizing your biases, seeing the humanity in people, and making sure you act on that every day. Cartwright nodded in agreement. He knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but for the first time in a long while, he felt hopeful. He wasn't sure where it would take him, but this was the moment that could change everything. And for that, he was thankful. In the weeks following his meeting with Maya Williams, Judge Cartwright's life began to change in ways he hadn't anticipated. The conversation they'd shared lingered in his mind, a constant reminder of the work ahead. He realized that an apology wasn't enough, and neither was the fleeting sense of guilt he had once felt. True change, he now understood, required more than just acknowledgement. It required a commitment to doing better every day. At first, Cartwright focused on small actions, small but significant shifts. He began to look more closely at the people who came before him in the courtroom, seeking to understand them, not just as cases, but as human beings with stories, challenges, and aspirations. He started asking more questions, listening more intently, and allowing his empathy to guide him. He consciously worked to set aside his biases, which had so often been hidden behind the veneer of impartiality. He knew he couldn't change everything at once, but these steps felt like the beginning of something bigger. But change, as Cartwright soon discovered, was not a simple path. It was a difficult and often uncomfortable journey, one that brought him face to face with the systems he had long been part of, systems that were far from perfect. He began to see the flaws in the way the justice system was structured, in how certain groups of people were treated differently based on their race, gender, or socioeconomic status. He had spent years upholding the law, but now he realized that the law itself sometimes fell short of true justice. One afternoon, while sitting at his desk reviewing a case, Cartwright found himself reading over the details of an ongoing trial involving a young black man, Andrew Hayes, accused of a petty theft. The case, though seemingly minor, had sparked heated debates in the local community. The defendant's background, the history of police involvement in his life, and the questionable nature of the arrest all pointed to a deeper issue: the way certain communities were disproportionately targeted. Cartwright found himself questioning whether this young man had been treated fairly by the system, or if he was just another victim of its biases. As Cartwright pondered the case, his thoughts turned to Maya. He recalled how she had spoken about the marginalized, the overlooked, and how she had dedicated her life to advocating for people like Ander. Maya had shown him that fairness wasn't just about following the law. It was about ensuring that the law worked for everyone, not just the privileged few. He realized in that moment that his role as a judge was not just to interpret the law, but to be an active participant in shaping the system. And that meant being aware of its flaws and working to correct them. It meant confronting uncomfortable truths, even when it meant questioning his own decisions and long-held beliefs. That evening, Cartwright sat at his kitchen table, a legal pad in front of him. He began to write a letter to Maya. It was a letter of thanks, but it was also a letter of commitment. Commitment to changing his approach to justice, commitment to listening and learning, and commitment to ensuring that everyone who stood before him in the courtroom was treated with dignity and respect. He had no illusions that this would be easy, but he had to start somewhere. As he finished the letter, he felt a sense of clarity. For the first time in his career, he didn't feel like he was just going through the motions. He felt like he was doing something that truly mattered. The road ahead would be long, but he was determined to walk it. He was no longer the man who had handed Maya Williams a fine without a second thought. He was someone who had seen his own limitations, someone who had learned that justice wasn't just about the law. It was about people, their lives, and their stories. The next day, Cartwright sent the letter to Maya. He wasn't sure what kind of response he would receive, but he hoped that, in some way, she would see that he was trying, that he was learning, that he was committed to doing better. And as he mailed the letter, he realized that his journey was far from over. But with each step, he was moving closer to becoming the judge he had always wanted to be, a judge who saw the humanity in every person who walked into his courtroom. Months passed after Judge Cartwright's conversation with Maya Williams, and while his journey of transformation had only just begun, the impact of his actions began to ripple through his life. The letter he had written to Maya had been met with warmth and appreciation, though Maya had also emphasized that real change would take time. She wasn't asking for instant perfection, but for consistency and effort. Cartwright understood now that change wasn't a single moment of clarity. It was a continuous, evolving process. In his courtroom, Cartwright began to notice subtle differences in his approach. He was more patient, more willing to listen, more deliberate in considering the contexts of each case. He often found himself reflecting on Maya's words, remembering that true justice wasn't just about the law. It was about fairness, humanity, and understanding the nuances of each individual story. He no longer saw himself as a distant figure delivering rulings from a position of authority. Instead, he saw himself as a servant of justice, entrusted with the responsibility to guide and protect, to question and challenge. One day, as Cartwright presided over a case involving an elderly woman, Evelyn McHale, accused of shoplifting from a local grocery store, his new perspective was put to the test. Evelyn was frail, with shaky hands and a weathered face. A reason for stealing? She had been struggling to afford her medications and groceries. The store had caught her on camera, but as Cartwright looked at Evelyn, he felt a deep unease. He could see the desperation in her eyes, and the reality of her situation weighed heavily on him. Cartwright had been trained to follow the law, to apply the punishment that was warranted for the crime. But in that moment, he realized that the punishment was irrelevant to Evelyn's needs. He asked the prosecutor to hold off on a ruling as he leaned forward, looking directly at Evelyn. "Ms. McHale," Cartwright said softly, "I know the law mandates certain actions here, but I need to understand why this happened. I want to hear your story." The room fell silent as Evelyn hesitated. Her voice cracked as she began to explain her struggles, how the rising costs of healthcare had drained her savings and left her with no choice but to steal food. It was not an excuse, she said, but a cry for help. Cartwright felt the weight of her words settle in the room. This wasn't a simple case of theft. This was a woman in crisis, a woman whose needs had been ignored by a system that should have protected her. He turned to the prosecutor and the defense attorney, both of whom seemed surprised by his approach. But Cartwright knew what needed to be done. He ordered the case dismissed, but not without taking further action. He connected Evelyn with social services, offering her access to resources for food, medicine, and financial support. It was a moment of grace and a defining one for Cartwright. He had taken the time to see Evelyn as a human being, not just as an accused person. His ruling wasn't based solely on the law. It was based on compassion, understanding, and a recognition that true justice wasn't always black and white. Word of Cartwright's new approach began to spread. Some people were skeptical, questioning whether he was letting his emotions cloud his judgment. But more often, people praised him for trying to make the system more humane, for acknowledging that the law wasn't just about punishment, it was about healing and restoring dignity. One evening, as Cartwright walked into his office, he received an unexpected phone call. It was Maya. "Judge Cartwright," she began, "I heard about what you did today. The case with Evelyn McHale. I just wanted to say, I'm proud of you. You're not just talking about change. You're making it happen." Her words hit Cartwright harder than he had expected. It wasn't the applause of the courtroom or the media that mattered to him. It was her recognition, her belief in his efforts. That meant everything. He had taken the first step toward becoming the judge he aspired to be, and that step had led him to a place of greater understanding and empathy. I couldn't have done it without your guidance, Cartwright replied. You opened my eyes to things I had never considered. I've learned so much, and I'm just getting started. As he hung up the phone, Cartwright felt a deep sense of peace settle over him. He wasn't perfect, and he knew the road ahead would be long and filled with challenges. But for the first time in his career, he felt confident that he was walking the right path. His work as a judge was no longer just about administering justice. It was about delivering it with compassion, fairness, and a genuine desire to make the world a better place for everyone who crossed his threshold. And in that quiet moment, Cartwright realized that true justice was about more than rulings and verdicts. It was about the lives behind the cases, the human stories that defined them. It was a lesson he would carry with him for the rest of his career.